Morning guys, Dave Canterbury at the Pathfinder School, out here by the fire underneath a tarp at a camp here, and just kind of getting a fire going here. What I wanted to do today was number one, I wanted to look at a product, a reflector oven. I've got two of them from two different companies, pretty much the only two companies that make them in the US now. And I want to test those reflector ovens, not because it's something I want to carry in my bushcraft kit every single day of the week, but because I'm studying some of Horace Kephart's writings right now, and he mentions in his book Camp Cookery quite often using this reflector oven. So I want to try and bake a loaf of bread today using his recipe in a reflector oven. So I've got to get a fire going to do that, cook myself up some salt-cured bacon while I'm waiting, have a little lunch. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit as we go through this series on Camp Cookery is, Horace Kephart was very much like Nesmik in that he was an innovator of his time as far as camping and woodcraft and, tramping, as Nesmik would call it, into the woods for recreational purposes. And I think that, it's interesting to think about the fact that we know who these guys are and we mention their names all the time, like Kephart and like Nesmik. And the only media outlet they had 100 years ago when their writings were prevalent was the written word. Print was all they had. Nowadays we have the internet, we have Facebook, we have YouTube, and all these different media outlets to spread our name out all over the world. And 100 years ago, all they had was a printed word, and circulation of print was not at its premium at that time either. And yet still we know who these people are. That's how much of an imprint or impact they made on people's lives. And I think that's interesting, and it's something that we as woodsmen today should try to emulate and impact as many lives as we can and pass on that tribal knowledge. So that's what I'm going to try to do with some of this camp cooking series, talking about the different implements that he used to cook with and some of his recipes. And we're going to start by making bread in a reflector oven. Stay with me, guys. Okay, guys, so let's start out by putting this reflector oven together. It actually folds very, very flat. I mean, you can see it's the same size as my haversack, disassembled, and very, very thin. You've got a package here, probably less than or right at 1/4 inch total inside this haversack. Now, Old Scout, and this is an Old Scout reflector oven out of Minnesota. He ships these in a burlap type or kind of a canvasy tote bag looking thing like your wife would bring home from the mall. So I put mine, and it's a little bit oversized, and I put mine in my haversack because it fits in there just perfectly. And it's a really, really simple system. It has 3 aluminum rods that basically become your grill, where you'd put your baking pan, whatever you're cooking in. You have a series of clips, and you have 12 of them that assemble the whole thing. And then you have the pieces and parts of the oven itself. And it's pretty simplistic. I like the fact that it's so simple, actually. And basically it's just like a origami puzzle that you put together. It's very, very simple. You don't really need instructions. All you have to do is look at the thing and you can pretty much tell how it goes together. It's got a front and a back, and it's got a top. It's got one shelf here. Obviously that piece fits into. And you've got one just like that for the other side that goes here. And then once you put those in, you would just put those pins through these holes. And I've got these pins on a piece of leather thong here. He actually put them on a carabiner when they were shipped. And then you just clip it together just like that. It's very simple. I'm actually taking more time doing this to show you than it actually takes once you've done it a couple of times. So then you have this. And this is the top, and it goes in exactly the same way. Just drop it in the slots, just like that, and put your pins in it. I'm doing this without glasses on, guys, so you have to excuse me if it looks like I'm fumbling just a little bit to find the spot that these pins go in. Okay, and then you have a back. I've got a weed stuck in it there. And the back just sits on there just like this, exactly the same way. And you put 2 pins in there. Really only takes about 3 minutes to set this up. You're not trying to talk about it while you do it. Then you have 3 holes that those rods go in. Pretty much the simplest way to do this is just take your rod and go ahead and put a clip through one of the holes in the rod, and then slide the rod through the hole. I'll start at the bottom here and put the other clip in the other side. So I'm just going to slide all 3 of these rods in one at a time. And then I'll put the other 3 clips in. Really a simple process. Probably should be tending my fire behind me. Okay, so there's 1, and we got 2 left. So 1 goes here in this rod, and 1 in the last rod down at the bottom, just like that. And then your oven is done. Now it's not, you know, the most bulletproof thing in the world, but it doesn't have to be. It's not supposed to be. You're not going to throw it around, step on it. You're going to sit it in front of your fire, and you're going to put your cooking pan or your cooking tray or whatever you're cooking on right there on that grill, and set it in front of your fire to convectively heat the food that you're cooking. And we'll get to that here in just a few minutes once we get our fire right. Okay, so let's talk about, right here's our Camp Cookery by Horace Kephart. It's got a recipe in it. We're going to have to break that down a little bit, I'm afraid, because I think his recipe calls for a pretty large loaf of bread that we really don't have the capability of cooking. We've got a measuring cup from our cup and bottle set, and we have water. The other components that we're going to need are some flour. I've got some whole wheat flour here. We're going to need some salt, and then we're going to need some grease, either lard or bacon grease or bear grease, he says in his book. And I've taken the liberty to put this in the reflector oven and make it a little bit more liquefied. He actually recommends stirring it in cold, but I thought that was going to be really much of a pain in the butt, so I decided not to do that. Now, what I've got here is that I'm going to cook with is I've got 2 stainless steel dog dish bowls. Okay, these things are a couple bucks a piece, and I can use this way to bake in, or I can put them together. I can put 2 of them together, and I can just clip them shut with these paper clips like this to make kind of a, what they called in the old days, a baker. And they don't make those bakers very much anymore. At least I can't find one if they do. And that was just a long bread loaf size folded piece of metal that had a lid on it. So it basically repeated itself on both sides, just like our dog dishes do, except it was square or rectangular. We don't have that luxury, so we're going to use these dog dishes and improvise. Common man stuff. See what we can do with that. That's another reason I say we're going to have to break our recipe down a little bit. But we're only going to use one side of this in our reflector oven. Now, the first thing that we're supposed to do is we're supposed to make sure that our pan is greased. So what I think we're going to do is we will grease one pan and we'll mix our ingredients in the other. And to do that, I'm just going to use a piece of rag or my hand, whichever one comes up the handiest, the fastest. Just happen to have a piece of linen over here. We'll use that. And I'm just going to pour some of this, get this a little bit greasy, and then I'm going to grease this pan so that our bread doesn't stick to the pan, basically, is the reason for that. So I'm just going to rub that in there real good in a good light coating and set that to the side. And that's the one we're going to cook in, and then we'll use our other one for our mixing. Now, what Kephart says in his book is that one of the major mistakes that folks make when they're making bread is they mess around too much with the ingredients, and it causes the air to come out of the bread. And from what I understand, when you put the salt and the flour and the baking powder together and mix it up. As soon as you add water to it, it starts to do a chemical reaction which releases water, or excuse me, releases air pockets into the bread. And the more you knead that and roll it out and things like that, it releases that air, that compressed gas out of that loaf, and it doesn't rise as well and it's not as fluffy. So he recommends just stirring your ingredients with a wooden spoon and then just dumping it into whatever you're going to cook it in. No messing around. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so let's look at what he says here. And what he says is you want 3 pints of flour. We're going to cut this down into thirds. So we're going to use 1 pint of flour. And 1 pint being, I assume he's talking about volume there, because his measuring devices would have been very similar to ours. Something that was probably measured in ounces, except he probably didn't have a scale to weigh volume weight or to weigh weight like that, so he just talked about things in ounces. So we're going to put a pint, which is 16 ounces, in our cup real quick of wheat flour. And this is just regular straight up wheat flour with no extras. And you can buy this stuff pretty cheap, or on the cheap, from places like, this is Hodgdon's Mill here, but you can get this stuff a lot of times at dollar stores, places like that, pretty cheap. Alright, so that gives us our first ingredient of the wheat flour. Now, let's talk about our next ingredient, which is pretty simple. It is 3 heaping teaspoons of baking powder. We're going to use 1. And 1 teaspoon of salt, so we're going to use a third. So we'll put that in next. So we're going to use 1, and we're going to call this a tablespoon. So we're just going to put about half of that in there, just like that, which should give us a teaspoon. And then we're going to put a third of, was that a teaspoon or a tablespoon? We're going to put 1 teaspoon, so we're going to put 1/3 of a teaspoon of salt in there, just like that. And we'll mix that up real quick in our cup. Okay, now to that mix, we're supposed to add our grease. And this is where you have to do a little bit of work, and that's why I made the grease a little bit more liquid than solid. Because Cathcart says in his book, you don't want to be a shirker on this part of the task. In other words, you don't want to be lazy about it, or your bread's going to be what he calls sad. You're going to have crappy bread, basically. That's what he's trying to tell you. So we're going to take our oil here, and it's calling for 2 heaping tablespoons of cold grease. Obviously our grease isn't cold, so it's going to be hard to get the heaping tablespoons. So we'll add a little extra for sake of purpose there. And we're supposed to mix that first with our ingredients so that there's no lumps. And I would say that's going to absorb pretty quickly in there. Probably part of the reason that he suggested using cold grease instead of hot, but you can see the lumps there. Push those off and mix those in. You can see that. And he said that, like I said, don't be a shirker on this portion of it, because you need this to be well mixed. So we'll just keep cutting those up and chopping them around and moving them until we get it mixed in there. Now, his next ingredient is water, and he suggests that you put the water in cold. And he says a scanty pint of cold water. He actually calls for 1 scant pint of cold water, which means, you know, a scant means not quite a pint or right at a pint of cold water. We're cutting this in thirds. So in our measuring system, our pint is 16 ounces. So we're going to put about 3 ounces or a little bit more in there, so we'll have our scanty 1/3. Again with our measuring cup here. Convenience of having those measurement markers in there. The first mark is 15 ounces on here, so I'm having to eyeball it just a little bit. But I'll be able to look at the dough itself. We know what dough is supposed to look like, so it shouldn't be too tough. Now, I think at this point we're going to go to a bigger stirring spoon. We're going to go to more of a spatula type spoon here and mix this up real good to get where we want to be before we put this in the oven. And hopefully by the time we get this done, our fire is going to be right. And remember what he said. He said, the more you mess with this, the worse off you are. So we really just want to get this whipped up as fast as we can into a dough and not do a lot of messing around if we can help it. And you can see that it's sticking together pretty good right now, so we probably don't have quite enough water in there. We're not soaking up all the dry either. So we'll put just a shade more water in there. A lot of cooking is eyeballing things for anybody who does it. Whether it's your grandmother or horse Kephart, you know, a pinch of this, a dash of that. The only person that knew what that was the person doing the cooking. So we're going to do the best we can here and get at least all of the mixture that's dry wet and get ourselves some kind of a doughy batter that we can cook and see how it turns out. We should have a loaf of wheat bread when we're done. Okay guys, I've just kind of scooched this around a little bit in this pan to make it kind of a cylinder. Pat it a little bit, straighten it out. Now we're just going to transfer it to our cooking pan, just like that. Roll it over in there. Do the same thing, just kind of flatten it out a little bit in there. And then we're going to put it right on our baking rack. I'm just kind of flatten it out to take up the entire surface here of the bottom of this, just like this. I think the more you mess with this, the worse off you're going to be, according to Mr. Kephart. So all I want to do is get this thing flattened out so it's thinner and it'll cook faster. Ready for the oven. All right guys, so we got our fire cooking here. Spread it out a little bit, and I may need to feed it a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and get this in front of it first. And I'm just going to set this pretty close to the edge of my fire pit and let that heat. I want to get it on even ground if I can. Prop it up with a stick here or something on the one side. There we go. And now I'm just going to let it cook. And it's probably going to take 25 minutes. So I'll get the fire fed up and we'll see how she goes. Okay guys, we're just speeding the fire slow and cooking it slow. It takes about 25 minutes according to Kephart's writing, so we're going to find out. Just wanted to keep you abreast of the situation. I've added a little more wood to the fire to get some flames going there. Get that reflector heated up. And about halfway through, he says to turn the pan 180 degrees. So we're going to turn that pan 180 degrees, and I'll show you how we test to see if the bread's done when we get to that point. Okay guys, I've got the fire burnt down pretty much to coals and just a little bit of wood on top. Looking really nice. Really hot in there. I don't know if you can see the heat waves in there on the camera or not, but I can sure see them. And I went to touch that pan a second ago because it's about ready to turn. And I'm telling you right now, that thing is hot. There's no doubt it's cooking. Okay, so we've been cooking for about 25 minutes here, and according to Kephart's directions, plenty hot for sure. I'll let the fire die down quite a bit now. You poke a stick in here And if it comes out clean and not doughy, your bread should be done. So I'm going to poke it down in a couple of spots and see what we got. Looks like it's coming out dry all the way around. I've turned it 1.5 times. Yeah, pretty dry. So I'd say we're probably pretty close to done. I'm going to pull it off the fire and we'll check it out. Okay guys, well, I'm sure that our bread's probably still hot, without a doubt here. Reflector oven's cooled down a little bit. Not too bad. I flipped it over in there to help it cool down just a little bit. Now, you don't want to slice fresh bread with a knife. You know, the proper way is to break pieces off just like that. And might be just a little bit of doughiness to it in there, but it's not bad. No, that's fine. Yeah, that's some good wheat bread. Got a nice fluff to it in there. It looks really good. It turned out great. Now, Kephart says that obviously if you leave this bread out, it's going to harden up. And what he would do is he would store this in a muslin sack and put it back in the reflector oven, just on the rack, and sprinkle water on top of it, very similar to what you would do with like rolls or biscuits that started to get stale in your cupboard in a microwave. And that convection will moisten it back up and make it good to eat again for at least a day or two. You know, as far as the ingredients go for this bread, obviously, you know, even in the 18th century, they bought provisions that they carried with them. And Kephart gives lists of provisions that he carried with him in hunting parties and camps and things like that, like staple items, you know, bread, flour, cornmeal, cornstarch, baking powder, salt, sugar, coffees, things like that. And there are obviously natural replacements for this stuff in the woods. You could make your flour from acorns, you could make it from the root of the cattail, but they didn't bother doing that stuff. They bought those provisions and took them with them, and that's kind of what we need to emulate and think about today. We don't want to put ourselves at the mercy of trying to find acorns to make flour when it's so easy to carry it with us. But if you just carry simple provisions, like I said, flour, coffee, sugar, salt, things like that, it's very easy to make a lot of good meals, hearty, robust meals out of those things, along with some dried goods. And we're going to talk about that as we go through this camp cooking series. Like I said, this is the Old Scout reflector oven. It's really nice. I'll put a link to his website on this video. I think the retail price of this stove is about 65 bucks, and it folds right up into this haversack. If you were carrying a Pathfinder haversack, you could stick it right down in there. I've got it slid right down the front of my Duluth Bushcraft pack in front of the garbage can, and there's no weight to it. I don't even know it's there, but it gives me something handy to cook with. You know, they carried quite a bit of stuff with them for cooking because they wanted to eat, and they wanted to eat good. So we're going to talk about the different implements that he carried, what he did with them, as well as some of the other frontiersmen and pioneers of the 18th and 19th century. Okay guys, well, I'm Dave Camber at the Pathfinder School. I appreciate you joining me for another video out here at the Pathfinder School. I thank you for your views, for your comments, for your support, for everything that you do for me, for my family, for all my affiliates and all my friends at the Pathfinder School. We'll be back with another video as soon as we can. Thanks a lot, guys.